power of the gavel. It's amazing, no? You just hit it and people obey. This is a very disciplined institution, the WTO. People respond well to the gavel. Welcome back. Toute bonne chose a une fin, hélas. All good things come to an end, and we've come to an end very quickly in this conference. 1 day and a half is clearly not enough. I think each one of the sessions, probably each one of the papers presented over the last day and a half could be the object of a full-fledged conference. I said yesterday in my introduction, all you'll get is an appetizer, a teaser. That's what you got. But we're not finished. We still have more food for thought, and we have assembled a very good closing panel for you, where we try to reflect on where we've been, what lessons we have learned along the way, and already I think a lot of the previous sessions have provided some very useful inputs into a retrospective look at services rulemaking and services market opening. But our task also, of course, in an academic setting, is to look forward and to chart a journey that academia and policy discussions, I think, are well placed to supply the market for ideas with the ideas needed to help governments and officials move forward with difficult agendas, and to do so on the basis of informed, fact-based, well-argued, well-debated. We did not shy away from debate in these 2 days, and we should not. That's the very essence of academic exchange. I always tell my students when I teach on services that the GATS was like a first date in services. And when you go on a first date, not much happens. The guys in this room will relate to what I'm saying. The whole purpose of a first date is to get a second date most of the time. And this was a date where we did not discuss access much. We just set the terms of what it is we're talking about. The vast majority of the time spent in the Uruguay round was devoted to crafting a framework starting from a blank page. That was a very daunting task, and not surprisingly, given the amount of learning by doing that was required to get from blank page to a framework, it took up perhaps more time than we had assumed, but in hindsight, not surprisingly, it took time. And then, Hamid will remember, because he was on that side of the table when this was occurring, someone said, but we also have to liberalize trade and services, don't we? Against the backdrop of the rules we have been debating for the last 6 years. I said, oh yeah, but we only have a year left. Hence, I think the analogy to the Uruguay round and to GATS 1.0, because that's all we have, as a mere meek down payment on the full potential that can be reaped from services rulemaking and services market opening. So we are very much waiting for the completion of date number 2, which would be the conclusion of the Doha round, and the news that Ambassador De Matteo shared with us today that apparently the round is soon to be back on track has to be something we must applaud and hope that services will find some place, a better place, a bigger place, a more central place in the very complicated quest for equilibrium that leads to the conclusion of a round. So we're going to discuss in this session, based on an initial presentation from Gabriel Gari from Queen Mary College, University of London, we're going to discuss where we've been, where we are, but also where we're going. And that seems to be somewhat fitting as a closing session. there are still tremendous challenges ahead of us. We just broached some of those this morning. State-owned enterprises, cross-border data flows, domestic regulation. These are all challenges that are going to be with us for quite some years. And thankfully, we have preferential agreements as living laboratories in which to also test out new ideas. We don't only tackle these issues here, we do it in tandem in a proliferating set of preferential agreements. And again, this provides a lot of space for informed comparative scholarship. And I know that we at the WTI, working with ICTSD, we want to continue to mine this field, because what I get from this exchange, I'm already concluding, is the tremendous appetite I detect for more and new ideas in a field that is still relatively new. We haven't been doing services for all that long, 2.5 decades at most, of negotiated conversations on services trade. It's still a process in which tremendous amounts of learning by doing continue to exist. So I'm going to give the floor first to Gabriel, and he is going to be then followed by 3 discussants who I have given very broad latitude to talk about things that are on their minds. The idea is not so much to focus exclusively on Gabriel's remarks, but to be complementary to his remarks from the very different vantage points that our discussants come from, with first Magnus Rentzhog from the Swedish National Board of Trade. And of course, the Board of Trade has been really a driving force, not only in changing the vocabulary, not always in the best way, because servicification is a mouthful that you are responsible for. It's your fault, Magnus. It's a hard word to pronounce and to use, but the Swedish Board of Trade, I must say, has been doing pioneering work that should be that we should collectively applaud, because it's providing really a global public good, changing the way we look at services, changing the way we look at the nexus between goods and services, and helping us figure out what the policy implications of that new geography of trade entails, and how we adapt and evolve services rule to this new reality. So I would assume, and I would expect, that Magnus would share with us some of the insights that flows from ongoing work that he's been involved with in Sweden, and also in the E15 initiative to which he's been contributing centrally. Then we're going to talk, I'm going to pass the floor to Pascal Kerneis, mon ami Pascal. I don't need to introduce him to you, I don't think so, from the European Services Forum, one of the most important voices, business voices in trade policy formulation in services. And Pascal is never short of opinions, he's never short of reasons to be upset and indignant, and that's why we put him on the podium, so that he shakes our cage a bit and tells us what we're not doing and what we should be doing, and we'll see if we can make him happy. Usually he's not. He's a grumpy French guy. But that's part of his job, actually, to be grumpy. And then we're going to give the last word, because, Hamid loves to have the last word, so I just would, just defer to Hamid. And Hamid is probably in this room the only guy that's been at it more than I have, and it shows, because he has more gray hair than I do. He's seen everything. He is the Forrest Gump of services. He's been there at every moment. He's had many Forrest Gump moments, and maybe this is one of them today, Hamid. So enjoy it, and we look forward, of course, to your always very, very wise words of advice and knowledge. Now, one last word. I know Gabriel is itching to start. I have been asked, and it seems a bit strange for me to be in this position, to convey information to you from the WTO bookshop that all books on trade and services are selling at a discount today. All books by Pierre Sauvé are at a deep discount today. Think of my mother more than me. And all books by Edward Elgar, not only on services, I'm told, but the Edward Elgar series, particularly the Research Handbooks, to which this series will soon contribute, are being sold at a discount. So at the coffee break, I expect all of you to be in the bookshop, and then I can figure out how much royalties I will make out of this announcement. But it didn't come from me, I promise. I was just asked to say this. Two more things. There are feedback forms apparently on your desks, and I would really urge you, it takes 3 minutes to give us some feedback. It's important. We are in the business of providing services, and so service providers like to receive feedback on the quality of the services they supply. Be honest, but give us feedback. The absence of feedback is worse than negative feedback. And then finally, apparently, there are signing sheets that allows us to keep track of who is in the audience, who can be on mailing lists, who do we stay in touch with. And apparently sometimes they get stuck at the end of tables. If we can ensure the greater mobility of those forms, that will be very helpful for the organizers. I promise to say no more. Gabriel, Gari, c'est à toi.
Okay. Pierre, thank you very much. Thank you very much for Sherry as well, and ICSID and the WTI for inviting me for this conference. When I sent the paper back in August that I prepared to Pierre, it didn't occur to me that I was going to get a reply to asking me to come here to talk about this in front of you. It was a great shock, and there's a big challenge, because what I'm going to say, the first two questions, so where we are, what have we achieved, you already know, and what is the way forward, I don't know. So that is a big challenge for me, but I'm still confident that I can assemble the facts of what has happened so far and put it in a way that may elicit discussions and thinking outside the box for the future. So starting with the most obvious question, and in a very briefly, but I think it's important to recap on this. What's the case for multilateral negotiations? Seeing that the industry is not that interested in what is happening in the GATS, why is multilateral negotiations on services important? Two things, two myths to combat here. First, that the myth that trade in services are already liberalized. Businesses may be doing business on the international arena without facing the consequences of barriers that may not trigger the need to ask demand for action on trade negotiations. That may be true in a number of sectors, but there are still pockets of restrictions that are very important, and in particular, I'm taking this from studies from the World Bank on applied regimes, and clearly you can see there the World Bank Services Trade Restrictiveness Index that even in the most liberal countries, the OECD regions, there are sectors, particularly transport and professional services, that are still overt quantitative restrictions, national discrimination measures that limit trade in services. In addition to that, there is a whole range of non-discriminatory restrictions that one should be looking at and try to figure out how to deal with that. And also the case of the importance, one thing is that the applied regime is liberalized, and the other thing, as you already know, is a legal binding commitment that not get it worse. So to make sure, give economic agents certainty that this is not going to get worse. And I'm thinking in particular the case of offshoring, for example, that is booming in Latin America and many other regions of the world as well, but coming from Latin America is an area I'm more familiar with. There's in the aftermath of the crisis, there were a huge movement in the United States for anti-offshore legislation, which raised some alarms in the sense that many of these services are not protected against a worsening of trade legislation, of the regulatory framework. So there's still a huge mountain to climb, to borrow Mamdouh's word, on services, and there's still need for certainty in terms of making commitments. And the other thing is the alternative paths outside the multilateral trading services a better alternative. Well, Martin has presented today some data about the degree of liberalization achieved at professional level. There are many studies here, and of course it's true that in terms of coverage, it goes far beyond GATT's commitments. But there is still small print. There are still a list of exceptions in national treatment commitments. There's still a number of things that say it's not the total solution to go on a preferential basis. And I quote as well a study from Atlung and Morrison that looks at a number of GATT minus elements that you can find in preferential trade agreements as well. And obviously sectors that are difficult to liberalize at multilateral level, they are also very difficult to deal with at a regional level, like audiovisual services or maritime services, depending the EU or the US may be involved there. And of course, the other disadvantage is there are no trade. It does not liberalize trade between major trading nations, between the US, EU, and China, Brazil. There's no negotiations there so far. Most regulatory barriers can only be addressed on an MFN basis, and PTAs do not have access to the WTO dispute settlement system. So yes, of course, there is a case for multilateral liberalization and making the efforts at multilateral level. Now, what has been achieved so far? I'm not going to go through the details of the whole history. These are just the hallmarks of the history of the negotiations on trading services so far, which you know very well. But maybe let me highlight just a couple of things. Of course, the year round, all the energy was consumed on negotiating the rules, very little for negotiating commitments. There's a little bit of good piece of evidence in the aftermath where the negotiations on financial services and telecommunications took place, and there was evidence of a good level of liberalization achieved there. And then we have the Doha. One important thing is Article 19. I think this is important in the sense that the mandate for liberalized trading services is independent from the Doha mandate. You have it in Article 18, so whatever happens with Doha, you still have a commitment to engage in negotiation rounds and achieve progressive liberalization of trading services. Doha, even the negotiation modalities were adopted before Doha. The Doha mandate, it only endorsed what has been doing so far. So that's an important thing to bear in mind. Then trying bilateral request offers, which didn't work well. Then trying plurilateral requests and offers, what also did not deliver much, until we get the signaling conference, which is the high watermark on trade liberalization in services, the best expectations there, linked to the expectations that other things that were conditioning progress on services, there were good signs that were going to be sorted out in agriculture and NAMA. But after that, nothing more happened. Until 2011, we in the mandate of, well, that's a summary statement of the General Council here, that to fully explore different negotiation principles. Some members picked up on this and engaged in TISA negotiations. And this is what is creating difficulties to achieving a balance in services and non-services sectors in the negotiations. So we've got the Bali ministerial declaration here to try to think with open mind, of course considering development, but looking at new possibilities. So there is an official recognition that we need to think afresh, how do we move forward this, and then committing the members to draft the working program for the next ministerial conference. So that's where we are at the moment. In terms of what has been delivered, fresh liberalization, very little. This is again relying on studies by the World Bank, that you can see a difference of GATS commitments, even what the GATS offers, and below that the applied regime. So even in the best world where the GATS offers that have been tabled so far were adopted, that would not reduce the level between binding regime and applied regime. We would still have a water in the middle. And this is further extended, bearing in mind what Martin said this morning, that many countries are engaged in further liberalization. So this gap is extending. However, so that's the situation in terms of deliverables of the negotiations. Now, what are the reasons for this lack of progress on the negotiations? And I'm going to put forward first, analyze what I don't think is the major reason for the lack of success. There's a lot of discussion pointing at the agreement itself as being an obstacle for progressing in the negotiations. It is outdated, it does not recognize the new realities, the sector classification does not respond to what is happening on the ground, the request offer approach, it's not appropriate by this type of negotiations. So let me address very quickly these things. I don't think that this really something inherent in the agreement itself that can be an obstacle to the negotiation. The scheduling approach, it's something that it was decided in the scheduling guidelines that can be changed. There's a lot of attributes talking about the negative list liberalization mode. But negative liberalization also has its own difficulties, and this is something that is not in the GATS uses a hybrid approach, where in each service sector you can list the barriers other that do not apply. That's a negative list, combining positive and negative list. Sector classification, again, there's no restrictions within the agreement to change it or to upgrade it. That's what members are doing in the Committee on Sectoral Classification, trying to think out new ways to classify services that better reflect the reality on the ground. Negotiating methods. The GATS does not say what negotiating method should be applied. In fact, in the 1986 Uruguay round mandate, they expressly said in the commitment, in the task to negotiate trading services, you should apply the GATS negotiating procedures. So it's an express reference to members to use GATS methods to negotiate trading services. But that's not in the GATS, and I will discuss a little bit later why this would not be necessarily the most appropriate way to negotiate trading services.
Not too much later.
No, yes, okay. Too flexible, really, there's too much flexibility. We are lost in flexibility, while the counterfactual would rigidity necessarily lead to a different result. And then there are big ambiguity of certain provisions that make the fear of making commitments. I just a couple of things very briefly. There are examples of success within the GATS, although they are minor. We have accession countries with wide lists of commitments. There are examples of liberalization beyond the applied regime, although there are, of course, the exceptions. There are commitments to future liberalization, again thinking mostly about accession countries. There are disciplines beyond market access, you know, the reference paper on telecommunication, and there are the commitments, the understanding on commitments in financial services also provide innovative ways of enhanced market access and national treatment through standstill obligations and automatic coverage of new services. So although the GATS may not be the perfect in every single sense, I wouldn't blame the agreement itself as the main reason for the lack of success. So what do we get? What's the alternative? Two things: old rules for a new trading landscape and old negotiation methods for new type of barriers. So old rules, the consensus practice, the mega rounds with a broad agenda, the single undertaking by which nothing is agreed unless everything agreed is agreed, and everyone must agree on everything, and the special and differential treatment. How does contrast this with a new reality on the ground, with larger and more diverse numbers of members, now 160, with new emerging trading powers? How do we accommodate this with the principle of relative reciprocity? Who is developing country and who is entitled not to give back commensurate trade concessions as the ones given to them by developed countries? How does this links to the new reality? Then the issue that we have border barriers within the border barriers that are much more sensitive, much more difficult to deal with, and competing PTAs, in particular TISA, these mechanics to retain concessions on services, to get something back in agriculture with the emergence of TISA has been weakened considerably. And finally, the other problem that I see is all reciprocity-driven model. What is the negotiation paradigm that has been applied to services? I refer to the Uruguay round and the references to GATT negotiation methods because obviously that was what was available at the time. But this modality, it's based on the idea of border measures, which are identifiable and quantifiable measures, and they are trade policy measures strict to sensu. So the quotas, the tariffs are there to obstruct trade. There's no other policy purpose, overt policy purpose for that. Then you have institutional concentration of power. Who can decide what to do with quotas and tariffs? It's the Ministry of Trade. They have authority to deal with that. And then you have producer-driven negotiations. Is how much I'm going to reduce my tariffs, what would be the impact on the import competing industry vis-a-vis the benefits that the export competing industry may get by a reduction of tariffs. These presumptions, these premises are not applicable on services. First of all, barriers, we work on the basis of lack of information. From statistics, you will know there's huge progress recently, but there's still a lot to learn about how much is it in terms of services. If it's very difficult to have a negotiating currency compared with what you would have with tariffs or quotas. How much do you give me if I reduce a foreign equity from 50 to 25%? How much are you going to give me in terms of national treatment for foreign banks? How do you put numbers to that to facilitate a negotiation that is based on a paradigm of exchange of reciprocal concessions? The subject matter, unlike the trade policy barriers on goods, policy measures that affect services pursue a wide range of issues. There may be a protectionist intent, but there may be legitimate purposes that are sought through these barriers. So it's much more difficult to isolate what is the protectionist element in a particular measure that is regulated for very loyal, honest duties of public services or addressing market failures, etc. Then we have the coordination and implementation challenges. Whereas dealing with tariffs may be decided by the Ministry of Commerce, there is a whole range of public authorities that have a say on measures that affect trading services. It's not just the trade diplomats, it's the regulators as well, and if a federal country, you have even a subsequent layer of distribution of competence on measures that may affect trading services. Then we have this issue of overrepresentation of defensive industries. On the goods paradigm, you have the import competing industry that is calling for defensive measures, and the export industry that is calling for, please do something to open markets. This, we've discussed this, there is not really happening in the context of services. You have a strong defensive interest, not just there may be consumers, but also the regulators themselves. They may be worried to see undertaking international binding commitments that they may limit their discretions. And on the other hand, we don't see a really strong force crying for opening new markets. 5 minutes, yes. So how can we do with that issue? There's not, if the trade negotiation offers concessions on services, how does it going to deal with all the defensive interests back home? So this is what would be the way forward then? I think we need to think about two things. What would be a potential package of concessions on market access and on rules that would be capable of attract a critical mass of support of WTO members? And then what would be the legal form that we should give to this negotiated outcome? So what would be looking for a critical mass to the extent that those who make the commitments will have peace of mind that there will be no free riding problems, and therefore they could make the commitments on an MFN basis. But what should be there to attract the support here? That's a big question, and the only thing I was thinking about is, first of all, think in those sectors where there's more coincidence on offensive interest between developed and developing countries. And if you look at some plurilateral requests in 2006 and some proposals that have been circulated among members, there are clusters of sectors on computer and related services and logistics services that attract a wide range of support in terms of offensive interest. So that would be one line of exploration there. The other one is trying to look at in terms of new forms of type of making commitments. So exploring the possibility of future commitments. If the concern of demanders is you need to reduce market access restrictions and you are concerned about the reforms that you need to implement for the purpose of opening the market, why not conditioning the opening of markets to technical assistance, similar to what is being doing in trade facilitation. In terms of commitments in Mode 4, and I'm thinking here in a paper written by Hoopman and Mamdouh from the World Bank as well, they're thinking about flexible commitments on Mode 4 that could be reduced depending on what is the volume of trade that is happening under those commitments. So that the opposite of to the paradigm that you make a commitment and then it's fixed for life. Also including source country obligations on Mode 4. So the country where the service suppliers go to the other country undertakes obligations of screening of who are the persons that are going to go there, what are the qualifications, etc. That would be another thing. And in terms of rules, looking at reference paper on telecommunications, the possibility would not be a case to replicate this for other network-based industries. We have Article 18 there where a negotiation could take place and adopted the commitments. That's another thing to bear in mind. And the other thing, and this I have to say, very much influenced with conversations I had with Hamid, in terms what would be the legal form of the negotiating outcome. When some discussions are taking place about how would the TISA would become part of the WTO if eventually it's multilateralized. Well, it would be an annex for the decision of the ministerial conference, but that requires consensus, and it's unlikely that those who are outside would give that. What about thinking at different ways that have been taking place before in the history of GATT? So what happened with the negotiations and the financial services and the telecommunications, where a critical mass of countries negotiated this, and they, under a protocol, they decided, well, this is going to be enter into force once a certain amount of instruments of ratification are deposited there. Or even the individual scheduling of upgrade concessions, scheduling of commitments subject to a certification process as well. So trying to think about different forms of overcoming this singular taking rule that is a little bit a straitjacket. And finally, to conclude, Pierre, we need to think about other things that are also relevant for the effective liberalization of trading services that are not just trade negotiation modality. It's not everything trade negotiation. Strengthening the WTO missing middle, so everything that has to do with transparency, discussions within the GATT's bodies in terms of trying to clarify the meaning of certain provisions that have raised fears of making commitments, the issue of regulatory cooperation, addressing non-discriminatory restrictions. Ultimately, trading services is a matter of trust between regulators, so we need to find a way of how we put them together. I know this at multilateral level is very difficult. And finally, research. We need to get not just more information, but what are the implications of making commitments? What would be the costs? What would be the benefits? If negotiators have more evidence about this, they would be more confident to undertake commitments, I think. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Gabriel. I'm sorry for pushing you, but I promised that I would.
Yes, that's fine.
I have to be credible in my threats. Magnus, sans plus attendre.
Thank you very much, and thank you for letting me sit on this panel. It's always an honor. And also thank you to Gabriel for reminding me of the good old year of services negotiation. That was the year 2000 when I joined the Swedish negotiation team. So that was when we started this built-in agenda before it became a Doha and hostage of that entire discussion. Those were the good old days. We went out to big Swedish service companies in what we thought was a quite analog world. It was easy to find who we should talk to and what we should talk about. We were wrong already then, and today we're even more wrong, as I will describe a little bit the world of services companies. And I will use the company, you might know it, is this fairly known Swedish telecommunication equipment producer called Ericsson. They sell telecom equipment, but at the same time they are our largest services exporter, the single largest services export for Sweden. So that's an example of the certification trend that we've been talking about. Ricardo mentioned it already yesterday, and I apologize for making that name very popular, but it's a fact of life that we see this trend, and it's not just in Sweden, we see it all over the world, that agriculture companies, manufacturing companies use more and more services and are more services dependent. And when they use that services, Ericsson for example then, they use all modes of supplies simultaneously. Okay? So Ericsson, when they sell their services, they rely on mode 1, they establish themselves mode 3, and mode 4 is hugely important for them. I want to stress that. They rely heavily on being able to send people to negotiate contract, install their very complicated equipment, repair it when sometimes it breaks down, and also upgrade. They run their services for their companies they sell them to, so they need constantly to send people all over the world. So there's a constant flow of people. So mode 4 is immensely important for them. And also, I mean, their production and selling is part of a global value chain, of course. We know the production is done that way, and a lot of small companies from developing countries down to, it could be goods companies, it could be services suppliers that add into their value chain, even small micro companies like a couple of persons doing some digital solutions, selling them, adding to the product that Ericsson sells in the end. So that's also an example of how world functions today and how you can trade in there. And also, of course, for Ericsson, all the digital issues are very important, being able to transfer their services and data and use data transfer for their products to function. I'm saying this just to describe how the world functions today and compare that with the good old year of 2000 when we thought it was much easier. And it's not just Ericsson. Ericsson's a big telecommunication company, world leader, perhaps in their field. But when we talk to smaller companies, I talked to a company called Aromatic that is in the food industry. They do bakery stuff. And I asked them, and they come with the same recipe, if you allow me to say that, about, we sell services. We need to send people constantly. We sit with our customers for 3 months before we even get the contract to sell our products to them. And we're very interested in digital solutions and selling and using data transfers. So this is just an example of how complicated the world is today and how important services and services negotiations are for companies like Aromatic and like Ericsson. So with that in mind, a number of years back, early Doha days, I took the subway from our office up to Ericsson's headquarters and asked them, so now we have the Doha negotiations, what do you want to get out of it? And the answer was ITA, ITA, and ITA. That's what they wanted. Why? Already then they'd given up on gas delivering liberalization. That's what they wanted. And they had the telecommunication package, so they were happy with that already, but they wanted liberalization. And they already 2002, 2003, they have given up on that. And ITA was the name of the game for them, which is a bit sad, thinking what's happened. So, we know what happened with the DADA, and Ericsson was one of the first to lose interest in services negotiations. So the question is, what can we do about that? So the new horizons, where do we want to go with this? Obviously, finalizing Doha would be a good start. But waiting for that to happen, we see all these bilateral agreements coming up with new solutions, and the TISA agreement, which is the second best option, I think, when it comes to moving the services agenda forward. And I think TISA negotiations, there we're onto something quite interesting and good. It's supposedly about binding your best FTA commitments and liberalizing services. I'm doubtful that's going to happen. At least that's my feeling. We're not going to see much liberalization, if any at all, in the TISA negotiation. But what we are focusing a lot in that negotiations on are different rules. Like we had the financial rules and telecommunication already in GATS. I think what's very good in TISA are the discussions on different sectoral regulation and domestic regulation, for that matter. And that's something we should bring back to this house. If we can't move on market access issues, let's start discussing regulation instead and get new annexes. Perhaps you don't have to have everyone aboard, but a plurilateral approach with an MFN basis and so forth. And I think that can do a lot. For example, looking at logistics services, which is hugely important for global value chains to work and for countries and small companies to tap into global value chains, logistics is a key aspect. Other areas to look is environmental services, for example, perhaps not, add that to the environmental goods negotiations. The entire digital agenda we have to take care of somehow to make WTO relevant for companies. I don't think that's a real GATS issue. We talked about that early on. I think it's a more horizontal issue, and I don't know exactly how we should handle that in WTO, but at least there must start a serious discussion about all the digital issues that are out there, from data flows, localization, technical barriers to data equipment and so forth. So that would be my first or my strongest push where to go from here. Then, of course, we would like to see market access commitments. Those are important. And we have to find ways to push countries to actually make commitments and at least bind their current openness. And this would include moving on mode 4. I think it's hugely important if it's going to be relevant for companies, and now I'm talking about our companies in Sweden. If we want to make this relevant for them, we need to move on mode 4. And also, it's both for them and for their consumers or the customers out in the world. Because their customers are interested in Ericsson engineers being able to come to them and help them with their problem. So you have to think about also both the suppliers and the consumers when you think about commitments and what you do in negotiations. Beyond that, I think we have to, and we talked about that, find different kind of soft law solutions. I think institutional regulatory cooperation to bring negotiators and regulatory people in different sectors together to find ways, discuss best practices, and find different ways to overcome burdens. I mean, regulators, like people, we can't live with them and we can't live without them. I think we have to accept that they're there, and we have to be able to discuss with them and talk trade issues with them and have them from different countries to get together and discuss how to facilitate trade for companies. So those will be forward-looking. I will finalize, but just a few words on the data issue. Now I'm talking about not data flows, but data number crunching, and that we discussed. We heard Pascal's plea before about statistics. And of course, statistics is hugely important, but we can't hide behind the lack of statistics. We did a study that we released now in the 1st of September on environmental services, where we looked on what services do companies selling environmental goods need to sell alongside those services. So we started talking to companies, and quite soon we identified a number of 7 services, I think, that were very relevant for all of these companies. Now, we cannot put the finger on the exact number of transactions going back and forth on these services. Still, we need these services are instrumental for green goods to be traded. And I think that's a good enough reason to start looking into these services. We cannot sit waiting for the exact number of transactions between country X and Y. And also there's another dimension here in the digital economy. You have all the app developers, so the micro companies. We're never going to find them in trade statistics. But they're out there, they're trading, they're making money, they're employing people. So let's help them also in the negotiations, be it here in this house, TISA, or somewhere else. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Magnus. As promised, Pascal.
Thank you, Pierre. Thank you to Sherry and Ricardo, and to you, Pierre, also to organize this. I think it's a big success because the room is nearly full, but I don't see enough WTO delegates, which is somewhere. a failure of our own, because I think to have this organization, this conference in this room is actually also to try to talk to the delegates. There are some, but not enough. That's my message. Thank you to Magnus also to be the business voice. So I don't need to bring much more as a business voice, because I think we have a very good one, just as Magnus is doing a great job, and the Swedish Board of Trade is something that I would recommend any country to have in its own. Now, I'm trying to make a screening of what has been done and where we're heading, looking at first at the multilateral level, then at the bilateral level that the EU has done, and then maybe some word on TISA. I'm not going to repeat things which have already been done, which is effectively that the GATS was a good agreement, but we have not used it. In the GATS, as Gabriel said, we had a very clever Article 19, which is in effect saying that services can be negotiated by its own with this built-in agenda. But as we know, this has not happened. And even if we started the GATS negotiation 2000 with a strong push by the EU, we wanted to have a millennium round in which we will have services, agriculture and NAMA all together, because we in the services industry were deeply persuaded that the winners are going to be the services, because we were going to pay on agriculture and NAMA and we will receive something on services. That was wrong. We didn't get that. And I think where we have been then, because the DDA didn't deliver at all, probably that has delivered TISA, because we felt hostage of agriculture and NAMA, so let's go for services only, back again, square one. But apparently not all countries are on that view, and therefore only a group of TISA, only a group of countries are doing TISA. I'd like to say something nevertheless of success in the multilateral level, which is the accession countries. That has been probably the best result in terms of new liberalization in the last 15 years. And that is often too much forgotten. So I think we have to pay tribute of WTO in bringing China, Vietnam, Saudi Arabia, and others, Ukraine. Probably the best schedule of commitment is the one of Ukraine. We're missing what? We're missing implementation. And the implementation of what has been achieved into the accession process is that something this House also has to look at. And the trade policy review is a good exercise, but it's not binding, and therefore we are missing some aspect. And our companies going into these new acceded countries, WTO, are missing some visibility into the implementation of what is on the paper. Another result is also the LDC. Services waiver, which is brand new. It's difficult for me to put any judgment on this one. I don't know how we're going to implement it. It seems to be for me a bit complicated, but with the benefit of the doubt, I'll give some credits that how I hope we will be able to achieve something in this one. But we have seen by what Gari and also we heard this morning, the best path of liberalization in the last 15 years has been the autonomous liberalization. Now, if we talk about trade negotiations, these autonomous liberalization are good, but the companies don't know always that it has actually taken place, and there is no advertising of this, and there is no legal security. So the job of the trade policy negotiators is indeed to bring that under the legal security of an international treaty. Because not much happened on the multilateral level, and we go to the bilateral level. What the EU has done, you talk about PTAs, others talk about RTAs. In the EU, we talk about FTAs. Actually, we now talk more about DCFTAs, for deep and comprehensive free trade agreement. And these words have some importance because that has been going more and more. And the more we have gone into the time, the better we have been, I think. But we started very low. First of all, the only one, what I called old FTA we signed with Mexico and Chile in 2000 and 2002, the services chapter are very poor and the services commitment are very, very poor. Not even as good as some of the GATS. So that was not a good starter. And then we have, or Pascal, when he was a commissioner for trade in the EU, declared a moratorium on any new FTA by the European Union because we focused and we were believing so much into the WTO that we're going to have 160 countries in one shot. Why should we go bilateral? Well, apparently we were wrong again. Because many FTAs have been signed in the meantime, but we have then tried to catch up. And in 5 years, since 2009, the EU has signed a very large number, or 2008, very large number of FTAs. To name them, EU CARIFORUM with 16 countries, EU Korea, EU Colombia, EU Peru, EU Singapore, EU Central America with 6 countries, and finally concluded but not yet ratified Singapore, I mentioned, and Canada. Well, if you count this number of countries, this is 30 countries. This is the number of countries who participated to the DDA revised offers. So in 5 years, we have already done a very good job. That's only on the surface. But we actually only catch up of what other countries did before. And all the countries I mentioned to you, most of them have signed an agreement with the United States or other OECD countries. So it's good what we've done. It's good to catch up because we had lost some market share, but it's not sufficient. For us now, still ongoing, and still on what we have to do, we now go for EU-Japan, which is a big cake. EU-Vietnam, probably done in the next year. EU-Thailand and EU-Malaysia a little bit blocked. And of course we have the TTIP, the EU-US Atlantic Agreement. We will see where we will be going. Also to keep in mind, many EPAs, European Partnership Agreement with African countries, have been finalized on an intermediary basis for the goods aspect, but many of the regions now have said that would like to engage with the EU to discuss about services. So that is also on our plate. We have EU-Mercosur and EU-India ongoing for years, and I don't see much progress, unfortunately, on that one, so I'm not going to go further. But the agreement we have signed with Korea is already a very high benchmark, and it is different than the other FTAs in the sense that, and it is a bit different than what we have in the traditional GATS sense, because, and we have mentioned that earlier also, when we negotiate Mode 3 agreement with Korea, it is not only about services. All the sectors have been part of the liberalization of what we called establishment, and therefore the mining, the agriculture, the fishing, and all the manufacturing sectors have been committed into these agreements. The same is for the Mode 4. The Mode 4 in the EU agreement are not limited to the services sectors, but of course are also open to all any manufacturing and other sectors which are interested to move people to do services and to do activity into these manufacturing or agricultural companies. And then we've got CETA. CETA is a comprehensive economic trade agreement with Canada. I will invite you to look at this agreement. This is a new benchmark for any trade agreement on planet. We have reached something here that I don't think any other trade agreement has reached so far. It is really establishing a new benchmark because it is not only a traditional agreement with all what I have already mentioned that we have with Korea, but it is more than that because we, first of all, and many people will be pleased with this, the EU has negotiated on a negative list approach. And I know it's only a way of negotiating, and I think we could have achieved the same result with these things. But it has got a tremendous impact on the EU because the EU had to take a picture of its own openness within the European Union. And that has been a difficult exercise, but this exercise has been done, and we know exactly what is open or closed to a foreign company across the 28 countries. And that, I think, is a good thing. And that now we know what we have given or not to Canada. But this agreement is also going further into public procurement. And Canada has accepted to negotiate in a way that it is not only about the federal level, but also looking at giving access to the professions which are regulated at province or state level, sub-federal level if you wish, as well as giving access to public procurement at sub-federal level. And that is, for us, the very new market access we have got. Because in many instances, even if it was not bound at state level or province level, it was not really closed, but public procurement were closed. And not all of that, because Canada is a member of GPA, but this agreement has been going much, much further than any previous agreement. Also, the Mode 4 offer that the EU had actually, in the GATS negotiation, DDA, the Mode 4 offer of the EU was pretty good, but never implemented before. Now it is in the CETA, and was going all through the categories of intra-corporate transferees, contract service suppliers, independent professionals, with all the name of the sectors which are in there and which are open. And they even have been pushed, the EU being pushed to move also under the spouses question, which is really critical for the business. So that is very positive. In addition, in the CETA, we have something in addition to that. We have negotiated for the first time an investment protection agreement with ICTSD into the agreement. We have negotiated some domestic regulation processes in which the mutual recognition agreement of qualification in some professional services will be negotiated. So that is new also. So everything of that is I think, very positive, and will engage you to look at this agreement because that is for us the new benchmark. Now let me go to TISA. TISA is what we're supposed to heading, and we hope we will go there. It's a plurilateral agreement, but the DDA Hong Kong declaration also tells us that the DDA was also a plurilateral agreement. So when we heard about this good news of having and moving into the services only, finally getting rid of agriculture and NAMA in our way, we say, okay, let's go, but let's stay in WTO and keep it up in there because we already have the mandate, let's do it. But unfortunately, we have been told by many WTO members it was not possible to stay here. So we had to go a little bit up the hill, which is unfortunate. But we have nevertheless, I think, pushed very much, and I think that the negotiators have been keen in making sure that the TISA structure is based on the GATT structure, so it's going to be again possible to bring it back here if there is any willingness at a point in time. It is negotiated in Geneva, which is for me a good signal, a positive signal that the negotiators are willing to tell the others that it is still open and possible. So I think that is good. But it is a services-only agreement. And therefore, we are effectively negotiating in silo, contrary to what Magnus told us, that the companies are not goods and services doesn't make any sense anymore in the modern economy. But this is what's happening in TISA, so that is maybe not that good. And we are losing the bargaining power of selling our agriculture and NAMA against services. So also there it is a bit more complicated. But as our members said, well, if everything is blocked here in WTO, it's better than nothing. Let's get for TISA. So this is what we're heading at. We're not completely sure where we are happy or not, but our companies are just fed up of waiting. So let's go for it. They say we're going to start at the best FTA level. And most of the countries participating to the FTA have effectively signed FTAs among themselves. And from what I understand, most of the offers which are on the table have been playing more or less with the rules, which is good. But our companies probably will not get much more new market access because it's about best FTA. So markets have already been open. Are we going to gain new market access through TISA? I think this remains to be done. This hybrid approach is a compromise where we are going to have the positive list for the market access and the national treatment on negative list, which is a very good, sensible thing. I mean, now most of the OECD countries will when they have opened up the country, the market for one country, they will do it on a non-discriminatory basis and consider them as domestic companies. So let's do that on the. But the compromise has been
that we do for the market access on positive list because we want to be sure that other countries which are not using this negative list approach on market access will come in. But unfortunately, apparently not many countries are coming in, so that's a bit complicated. So let's focus on the disciplines. This is what this TISA is going to be good. Let's focus on the new disciplines. Well, on the disciplines, many of the sector-specific disciplines which are now written down on financial services, on telecom, on professional services, are going to be effectively good, but we have them already in most of the bilaterals. It is going to be about updating text that you already know, the understanding of financial services and the annex on financial services. You take a bit of what has been agreed in these FTAs on financial services, on telecom, and you have the text. So it's not going to be brand new. It's good to have that put into a plurilateral, but we need to make sure that this is going to be, if possible, a bit better. Then at the horizontal level, the TISA might be bringing something really new in a plurilateral level, which is on state-owned enterprises that we heard this morning, which is on data flow that we heard this morning, which is on transparency and domestic regulation, which has been discussed in this house for so long, with very good text, very good things. We just need to implement them. So let's do that in TISA if we cannot do it in the WTO. So that is where we are heading. A final word, Chairman, two final words. One, the EGA. Because next week we have the 10th, I think, round of TISA is going to take place here in Geneva. Well, there is another round actually taking place also next week in Geneva. And this is the European Environmental Goods Agreement. On the agenda, waste management, water management, noise reduction. Those of you who would know 120 classification would know that it is actually about services classification. But services is not on the agenda. It's about reduction of tariff on the goods. And I agree with Magnus. If this negotiation want to be real useful, because it's not only about being successful and reducing the tariff in maybe hundreds instead of 54 a list of products, it's going to be good, but it's not going to be revolutionary. If we want to achieve something in green economy, they need to bring the services around the table and not having a European environmental goods agreement, but also environmental goods and services agreement. My last word is, if we're heading, listening to what Hamid is going to tell us, post-Bali, what is going to be for services in post-Bali? What are you going to write in the next weeks? I don't think that it's going to be sensitive or it's going to be realistic to take back the 2008 offers from the drawer and trying to negotiate services again. I don't think this is going to work. I'm afraid that the negotiating power of this house is not going to work because agriculture and NAMA is not back on the table. So I hope that we will keep the services subject into the post-Bali, but going for general principles where all countries will agree to move on transparency on the regulations, licensing procedures, a kind of post-Bali trade facilitation agreement for services. And that will be attractive to all WTO members. I stop here, Chairman.
Merci. Also for ignoring all my pleas. People from Brittany, I know this for a fact because I married a woman who's from Brittany. I mean, they're hard-headed. They're just oblivious to anything you tell them. You're from Brittany, no?
I am. Far west.
C'est ce que je pensais. So let's hope Hamid is not from the Brittany part of Egypt, and will be more cooperative, so that we leave quite a bit of time, because the room is full. It is quite amazing, and I think we have to be very, very happy with the turnout, Sherry. The room is full, and so I think there will be a lot of questions from the floor. And I'd like to bring also on the table, on the discussion, a lot of the very useful things that we heard in the last session this morning on architectural issues that I think deserve also some further discussion. But I'm sure actually Hamid will bridge that divide very nicely, because that's usually what you like to talk to us about, architectures.
Thank you, Pierre, and thank you.
Not surprising, Egyptians have architecture in their DNA, no?
All right, just look at the pyramids.
Exactly.
Thank you for the invitation and for the opportunity. Let me first congratulate Gabriel for his excellent presentation, because I thought it was quite a comprehensive inventory of titles that really describe the situation, where we came from, where we are today, and raise very important questions about where we go from here. I'm not going to... Gabriel's presentation actually makes it very difficult not to overlap with some of what he said, so let me just pick on some of the points and try to expand on them a little bit. I'm not going to repeat what was said about the different world we're living in today, and shifts in geopolitical powers and trade powers and all that, what that means also for international trade, but also the different organization we have today. The WTO today is a very, very different organization from the one that we were used to 25 years ago, when negotiating methods were very different. The number of members, we were about 90 contracting parties to the GATT, three-quarters of which were a silent majority. Consensus was relatively easy to come by. It's a very different organization today. 160 members makes any consensus decision a huge challenge, and in many instances a hostage-taking opportunity. Now, be that as it may, and we know where we've come from. We've come also from a WTO agreement that was established 20 years ago with a services instrument that has been designed to provide a legal framework for continuing negotiations. We haven't actually negotiated a lot since the Uruguay round. Actually, if we consider that the finance and telecoms negotiations were just leftovers from the Uruguay round, then we haven't really done any negotiations over the past 20 years. It reminds me of Don McLean's song, the American Pie, or The Day the Music Died, when he said, "We all got up to dance, but we never got the chance." That's exactly what happened in the services negotiations. 2000, we started saying, okay, now is the time, let's roll up our sleeves and let's start negotiating on market access. And it was no accident, really, that the design of the built-in agenda negotiations was agriculture and services. Your trade-off was there. I mean, going back to the Uruguay round, you remember the grand design of the Uruguay round was what? It was textiles and agriculture in return for trips and services. Now, why am I making this point? Is because any negotiation, in order to be successful, the agenda would have to be packaged with trade-offs. Now, what have we seen in the DDA and the services negotiations would actually lead me to the conclusion that the biggest problem we've been having in the services negotiations is not indigenous to the services agenda itself. It's related to the broader context in which negotiations have been taking place, and the lack of push by the demanders. And I've talked about this before, the fact that during the first 6 years of the DDA, services was never raised, not even once, in the mini ministerials that used to take place all the time. Where do we stand today? There's a broader context in which the services negotiations fit. We do have, as our Director General said, a serious problem with the negotiating function of the WTO. And in my view, this starts with the packaging of the agenda. We're talking about the post-Bali work program, and we will try to put together a work program over the next few months. There is a challenge that I see in constructing that post-Bali work program. And the biggest challenge is really whether we would be able to have a serious and meaningful services negotiations taking place in the WTO while TISA is taking place outside. Don't get me wrong, I was never against TISA because it had to happen. The question is, can we have two meaningful negotiations taking place at the same time? That's a serious question we need to think about. Because the implications for that perhaps are not going to be only for the services negotiations here, but are going to be for the negotiating function of the WTO in general. I think it would take a tremendous superhuman effort to have a serious agriculture or NAMA negotiating processes here if you don't have a meaningful services negotiation. Where would the trade-offs come from? It's a very, very basic and elementary question. So there needs to be some thought given to that. Because there are no huge impediments to having a meaningful services negotiations here. You look at the situation today and consider the following. Point number one, as has been mentioned, services liberalization has been progressing way, way beyond any negotiations. The only exception being the accession negotiations. But the process of liberalization itself has predominantly been autonomous. Second, that means that there are lots of low-hanging fruits that can be captured in a services negotiation here without even inflicting any pains of regulatory or policy adjustments back home. Third, the instrument is there. And let's avoid distractions by raising questions like, oh no, but there's a problem with the legal framework, oh, there's a problem with the classification system. Of course, everything needs to be updated. The framework has been designed to be a forum for continuous negotiations. What you need is to build on it. It's not to change it. And when it comes to classification, just one example, there is no mandatory classification system. You can choose any classification system in the negotiations. The real challenge is to get to the negotiating table. Consider also one important factor, that the services negotiations among all the items of the DDA, and in particular the market access triangle, NAM, agriculture and services, the services negotiations is the only one that is self-contained and can actually provide its own balance within the services agenda. You can't say the same about agriculture and NAMA. That's why you don't have a TISA equivalent for agriculture and NAMA. That's why the services negotiations, while being perhaps the most valuable part of the negotiating agenda, I'm talking globally. I'm sure there are agriculture champions out there who would question that, but I'm talking globally. And I see Alessandro looking at me and smiling. But in global terms, it is the most important file on the negotiating agenda, market access negotiating agenda in the WTO. At the same time, if it escapes, it means that we have a problem. We have an institutional problem. There are two sides, and Gabriel actually cited that very well, to the services negotiating agenda. There's the market access side and there is the rules side. And again, looking back at what I mentioned in the beginning, the negotiating methods, I think we have been in services following methods that are different from what has been followed in agriculture and NAMA. Where those two areas were negotiating on the basis of modalities that would need to be adopted by consensus before market access negotiations proceed, in services, we've always adopted the request offer technique. Now, it might sound a little bit primitive, but actually there's a huge advantage in following a request offer procedure, although it might be a bit tedious. One of the advantages is countries would get to tailor their commitments according to what they can do through negotiations. Second is that you get around the challenge, the institutional challenge today of how do you apply special and differential treatment. I thought we crossed that bridge when we were drafting the gas, and we replaced that concept with flexibility for individual developing countries, where each developing country would specify the flexibilities that it needs. Third, you can go critical mass, and by critical mass I mean for every deal, for every market access area, you have your critical mass, meaning you have all the participants that are important traders in that sector on board, making the adequate level of commitments in a way that eliminates or reduces to an acceptable level the free rider risk. It's very difficult to achieve all these things if you apply a formula like a modalities-based approach that would have to be accepted by everyone and starts with the presumption there is a one-size-fits-all, and then you keep piling up flexibilities, and then you end up actually applying the modalities to the least significant trade items. So the approach is there, and it has been applied in the past, and it has worked. Good examples are telecoms and financial services. The beauty also of the legal framework is that you have the possibility of designing templates. It's not just request offer and you nickel and dime in every sector and subsector, but you can also develop templates like the financial services understanding. I know there's some criticism, and there was at the time, but actually look at the technique itself. It allows you to mix market access elements like an across-the-board standstill, like the commitments on cross-border data flows, commitments on new services, elements that are not normally contained in a regular approach, and you can mix that with regulatory issues as well. With respect to transparency, you can have commitments even on government procurement. You can tailor it any way you want. So the market access agenda is there. There's a lot of work that was done during the DDA, and it is there. And I'm sure, of course, as Pascal said, you can't really go back to the 2005 revised offers and say that we picked things when we left them. No, you need a new approach. One idea that actually has been gaining traction is, okay, why don't we look at the liberalization that has been taking place so far, and we try to see how much of that we can bind, and then we'll see what more we can add. The rules side. And this is where we get to slightly more complicated questions about the legal forms of outcome and how that actually can influence the negotiating process itself. And I think here we, even in services, need to try to think a little bit outside the box. We have been negotiating on horizontal disciplines for domestic regulation for the past 14 years. We have a text. Some people don't like it, some people like it, but we do have a text. But what we learned over the past 14 years is that actually first of all, going horizontal, for horizontal disciplines, leads to a lower common denominator, because apart from transparency and some procedural issues, which are important, you can't really get deeper into the substantive regulations and disciplines for specific sectors. But the other thing that we learned as well, and I think is very important, is the assumption that we start with respect to what kind of legal outcome are we aiming for. Because we have been proceeding, for example, on the assumption that we were heading for an annex to the GATS, which leads to an amendment procedure. That process inherently makes it necessary to have consensus decisions every step of the way. You need consensus to agree that the chairman will produce a text. You need consensus to agree that the chairman would revise the text. At the end, you would need to adopt it by consensus. That is desirable, and it looks neat and everything, but is it really efficient? There is an alternative which we have applied in the past, which is instead of going down that road, you go down the road of a reference paper, like what we did with basic telecommunications. Then you go critical mass, not just on market access, but also on rules. What does that mean? Is an interested group of members would get together and start developing a template. It's another template, and you don't need consensus to adopt it, and it would take effect through scheduling. So what you do actually is that you separate the process of preparing the template from the process of negotiating adherence to it. All these possibilities are there. The question is, can we really come back to the table and start negotiating again while TISA is taking place? Maybe a good idea is that You get on with TISA and just get it over and done with and come back to the lakeside. How quickly can you do that? But looking at the situation as it is, I think the most important conclusion is that I certainly don't see any insurmountable technical, legal, or even realistic difficulties in having serious services negotiations in the WTO if members want to. That's the big question. If they want to. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hamid. That was short, sweet, to the point, and in the nature of Egyptian architecture. So I think a lot of food for thought on the table. I'm going to open up the floor. We have over 20 minutes left, which is not bad. So please identify yourself and please try to keep your questions short, to the point. We're not seeking comments, we're seeking questions. Yes, please.
Thank you. Alessandro Pinto from the Mission of Brazil. I'm a services delegate for Brazil. Actually, I have lots of comments, so if you allow me, I'll try to be as brief as possible.
Can you make those into questions?
They're built-in questions, just like the egg and the services agreement. I would like to address some of the comments. I'll try to share some thoughts from a negotiating, developing country perspective to try to strike maybe a better balance of views. So my first comment is addressed to Mr. Gabriel, Gari, and it refers to the package of topics and methods that would attract critical mass of WTO members to services negotiations. And the first one he mentioned was like the clusters of services might attract a wider range of WTO members. I would just like to remind in that respect, it has been attempted many times in the past throughout the Doha round negotiations. There are proposals out there in that regard, and I've never seen them attract a significant number of members, except for those who share offensive interests, of course, in those sectors. And actually, much on the contrary, I would say that they take away a lot of the negotiating flexibility that is needed to reach, significant and meaningful outcomes. The other idea was like the idea to condition opening to technical assistance. In an arrangement that would be similar to the trade facilitation agreement. The flip side of that is that if you promise technical assistance, you're probably going to demand something in return for that. And that might raise the level of ambition of the obligation to tax, and that might create a negotiating hurdle for the negotiations. Flexible commitments in Mode 4. I wonder why they should be flexible only on Mode 4. As much as developing countries have developed capacity in many services sectors, we know for a fact that very few of them have attained that stage. It's very concentrated, so it's not true for the vast majority of developing countries. Their interests in services are still very narrowly defined, and they have much to do with tourism, Mode 4, and services like that. And now, just moving on to some ideas that were shared by Mr. Pascal. He mentioned that there is a built-in mandate under Article 19 of the GATT for services negotiations. Hamid has already reminded all of us that the same goes for the agriculture agreement. But I don't see the same leverage, the same kind of traction for serious negotiations in agriculture. But perhaps since those are allegedly the two most under-regulated, let's say, areas in the WTO, maybe we could explore some trade-offs. We could put NAMA aside and to explore trade-offs between services and agriculture, and might reach an outcome that is convenient for all of us. As far as accession countries, the best, you've claimed that they are the best results in negotiation in recent years. Then again, they might be from an offensive interest perspective, but if you ask some of the acceding members if they're that happy with that, or if they agree with the process and the different benchmarks and standards, they might not come to an agreement on that regard. The best path to liberalization has been autonomous liberalization, but then there is no legal security. I can't speak for Brazil. There has been some autonomous liberalization in Brazil. It's true that we have a lot of water between our bound commitments and the existing framework, but if you go on the ground, you're going to see lots of European companies making tons of profits, for example, in the financial and the telecom sector, and they're very happy about the security and the stability of the legal and regulatory framework for the most part. So just to say that there are other factors than trade and investment agreements that are key in attracting companies to the country, the size of the domestic market and the growth prospects and infrastructure and so on and so forth. I think I've already talked too much, so I'll stop here. Thank you so much for your patience.
Maybe we should embed a sunset clause in the WTO, and everybody has to re-accede if we don't conclude a round by a given date, and then you would experience the joy of accession. It's true that it's not shared joy depending on which side of the table you are. Even though I completely agree with Pascal's characterization, they've been good. Yes, come to me, baby.
Hi, my name is Atul Sharma. I'm an Indian lawyer. So my question is to Gabriel, and I think it's not probably polite to pit two academics against each other, but I'll be a little adventurous because both of them are sitting on the same table. One of the suggestions given by Gabriel to overcome the consensus formula is the TISA approach. But if I remember listening to Professor Sauvé back in India and read one of his papers back in March, I think, where he has criticized this precise approach as to why TISA probably has no future when it comes to multilateralism. So in your paper, have you tried to address some of his concerns raised on the approach taken under TISA?
Alejandro?
I think it's worth a question about some of the comments that have been made, particularly by Hamid, I'm sorry, about the trade-offs. And here one issue is, I'll take as a point of departure what has been said by several yesterday and today, is that when countries negotiate, what countries do for the most part is that they bind their existing situation, in some instances with a ratcheting effect, so it's a living, moving binding, and that's it. But they don't actually liberalize trade through negotiations, unless it's accessions, and we know why. So if the suggestion is there will be a trade-off between, let's say, agriculture, NAMA, and services, well, in services you're just binding your existing situation, where as on NAMA and agriculture, you're actually getting actual market opening and new business opportunities. I don't see it's a feasible trade-off overall in that respect. So I'm troubled a little bit by that notion. Unless the trade-off, you eliminate all the water on NAMA, agriculture subsidies, and services, which could be another point of departure. My question is that, I'd like to hear some comments, would it not be better to just simply organize the services negotiations on a sectoral basis? So let each sector find its own critical mass, and let countries then define on a sector basis if they want to go beyond the existing situation and how, because each sector will have its own logic, its own public policies, its own unique set of regulators, and maybe you'll get perhaps a lot more traction in that respect than approaching services negotiations to request and offer and other techniques which I think perhaps make not much sense in view of the particularities of services and its different public policies in each sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Alessandro. That's a very interesting question. How much intersectoral bargaining is there really in services? My own experience would suggest that not much. There is a very vertical nature to the way in which services negotiations are transacted. We very rarely say, we're not going to agree on finance because we're not happy with what we got in telecoms. This may be the case in some countries, but it's not really how things are happening. So your idea, which may be immediately resisted by saying, no, that's going to limit the scope for bargaining, maybe we exaggerate the scope for bargaining that truly exists in the transacting of services negotiations, but that's just a Canadian perspective. Who is next? Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Hiroki Takabayashi of the Mission of Japan here in Geneva. My question concerns the negotiating function of WTO, not only in trading services but also the others. And then that reminds me of the very recent discussions about the trade facilitation agreement, and the current which has been huge. There has been discussions actually taking place to explore the plurilaterals of when it comes to the trade facilitation agreement, and luckily or unluckily, it was not the case. And my question is, I'm fascinated to hear what Hamid said about the new approach demonstrated by the reference papers and things like that. But my question is whether, before questioning, and I see the discussions going to take place about the trade facilitation agreement to go to the plurilaterals. There are certain sensitivities raised by some members of the WTO. So my question is whether that kind of discussions concerning trade facilitation agreements have some impact on trading services negotiations when we really pursue this plurilateral approach. Thank you.
Mon ami.
Merci beaucoup, Pierre. I'm Pablo Escobar from the Mission of Ecuador here in Geneva. I would like to start by saying that I agree with many of the comments made by my Brazilian colleague, but I will not repeat them. And I just have one question for Gabriel, Gari, or to any other of the other panelists. I think you and the other speakers have talked about market access, but whenever we speak about market access, we also should talk about the possibility of temporarily restricting the imports. I'm referring to a safeguard. And Gabriel, you said that the GATT has an inbuilt mechanism to continue the negotiations, but there is also a mandate to negotiate an emergency safeguard mechanism. How do you see this mechanism, and what role could it play to move the negotiations forward so as to give assurance to members that whenever commitments they make, they can temporarily restrict on the basis of certain parameters? Thank you.
Very good question. It remains an unfinished piece of business. The Yoga round is not finished, it seems, and we're 13 years into the Doha round on this issue. I'm going to take maybe 2 more questions, if there are 2 more questions, and then I'm going to go back to our panel for their closing remarks before we close the meeting. Yes.
Chang Han, I'm with the Chinese mission to the WTO. My question is for all the panelists, given that we still have ample time. What do you think is the element that will attract developing countries to, actively participate in the services negotiation? Because I just have this feeling that there is lack of motivation from the developing countries, including big emerging markets like China, especially from the industries. Of course, now our services industries are growing rapidly, and they are catching up with their foreign counterparts, and including European and American counterparts, but there is a lack of motivation for them to go abroad. And actually, they don't feel that they have a stake in the multilateral negotiation or, TISA negotiation. Of course, different countries have different, strategies when they are pursuing negotiations. And China has a very strong government to push forward the reform and opening up. But I think the real motivation should come from the industries. And there is really a substantial lack of motivation from the industries in the developing countries. And then my question is, how do you persuade them to participate in the negotiation? What is the, sexy part of the multilateral services negotiation and TISA negotiation for them?
Well, I'm sure Pascal will have ideas on that because that's his job in the European context. But I'm quite surprised, honestly, to hear you say what you just said. So China knocked at the door of TISA based on the interests solely of the Chinese government, but not the Chinese industry?
Well, I will say that there are, indeed, a certain degree of interest from the industries, but actually, frankly speaking, and of course that is my personal observation, that there is still a lack of industry support when it comes to substantial proposals, textual proposals when it comes to disciplines on different sectors.
Okay. That may have more to do with the process of trade policy formulation and how you conduct consultations and the experience of firms with doing that. That's an interesting insight. There is scope for one last question. Who wants to be that happy person? Nobody, it seems. Okay. Then I will go back to the panel, and I'm going to start in the same order in which you spoke initially. Gabriel.
Okay. Thank you very much for the questions. I start with the colleague from India with respect to the multilateralization of TISA. That's a big challenge. I think it's a good question to put to the TISA members that are negotiating this. How do you bring that back into the WTO? I don't know what they have in their minds. Possible ways would be, for example, Annex 4, to include it as a plurilateral agreement on a non-MFN basis, like the government procurement, but that requires consensus, so it's unlikely that non-TISA members will vote happily for that. Other thing could be for, as long as it covers substantially all trade, to go for an exception under Article 5. you will lose the dispute settlement system of the WTO, so not sure what they are thinking in terms of enforcement. Theoretically a waiver, but it's highly unlikely. You know, waivers again requires a huge majority and it's for a limited period of time for exceptional reasons. So I don't know. That's what I think. I think the only way forward would be to think about ways to find out a critical mass and negotiate that on an MFN basis. And that brings me to Pablo and Alessandro questions. What can we put into that package that can be attractive? So with respect to the clusters, you know better than me as a negotiator, this has been tried before and it didn't went forward. I wonder the reason this did not went forward is because of the lack of interest in the sector, or because of the broader context of the negotiations that freeze any possible potential step forward. Because I think that there are more and more trading opportunities for developing countries. The days where GATS, when the GATS starts, that the only comparative advantage was thought by Mode 4, I think technology, and we have discussed this a lot, has opened a whole range of issues. So potentially, I can see, theoretically at least, I can think that there should be interest from the industry in market access that they may have already, but on securing that market access with binding commitments. So maybe the reason is because of the broader context. Then why flexibility in Mode 4 and in not other modes? Purely because of the sensitivity of Mode 4, this highly sensitive. Perhaps that does not mean that you cannot think about flexibility in other sectors, in other modes as well. But I thought, well, this could be one possibility to start with, and that brings me to the safeguards. It's a good idea to have we have a mandate to negotiate safeguards. Would that be the peace of mind of the possibility to impose safeguards would be a green light to undertake further commitments? My impression from as an outsider, the way the safeguards negotiations is being looked at is basically importing the safeguard model of the goods commitments, and doesn't seem to match directly, especially if you have Mode 3 there. How would that work? So I think there may be technical issues on designing a safeguards for trading services. But I do think that it's important to think about ways of including flexibilities of commitments, thinking about that as a possible way forward, but not sure what's the way. Let's see if there's something else. No, I don't remember. I think there's one more on implementation. Alessandro mentioned that you said, well, one idea is to condition further commitments on implementation. Why do I think? And I borrowed this idea from Hochman and Mamdouh that they discuss this package. But why I think this would make sense? Because sometimes to liberalize, you have to regulate first. I mean, regulation could be a precondition for liberalization. To have a sound legal framework that can address competition, etc. And for that purpose, you say, well, we cannot do this because we have not the appropriate framework, regulatory framework. Well, if there is technical aid or help to implement that regulatory framework, that again potentially could be a way to unleash the will to make commitments on Mode 3, for example. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Gabriel. Magnus, Pascal, and Hamid, I'm going to give you 2 minutes each to round up, please.
Okay. So I had a long answer prepared. On the question, I think there's an interesting question from Chinese delegation there. How do we persuade companies to, well, not export, I can't persuade them there, but help them if they want to export? And I think one way we can do it is really to soul search, go back to our countries and see where are we trading and what are the barriers. Is what we're doing now what they need, what they are looking for? One thing I'm thinking about here is there's a lot of focus on opening US and EU market. Not enough, perhaps, pressure on opening your neighboring market, where you perhaps are have more interest. But that's just an idea. I want to pick up on the comments from the gentleman from Brazil. Of course, there are very many issues affecting where we are trading and how we're trading, and of course, European companies are in Brazil. Many of them very happy there. I have example of Swedish companies not very happy in Brazil, but I'm not going to say that too much here. But in this house, we have a mandate to discuss some certain topics, trade-related issues. And that's our mandate. And I think we should use that mandate to help our companies with their issues. So that mandate has to do with trade barriers and trade regulation. So you can use that to open other markets, and you can use that to see on your own market what's the problem. And I want to refer everyone to a very interesting study that came out from the Brazilian Industry Coalition, or whatever they're called. I don't know exactly what they're called, on servicification of Brazilian industry. And there said that, well, we are becoming service-advised, the industry in Brazil, using more and more services, relying more and more on services. But the problem for us is the more services we need and use and rely on, the worse this is for us. Because our competitors gain advantage the more services they are. And the reason was because of low quality and high cost services in Brazil. For us, when we did the certification studies in Sweden, our answer was the opposite. High quality, low price on services, which gave us a competitive edge. The Brazilian answer was the way around. So now what I wanted to do here was just to think about, what can we do to address that problem? Maybe not WTO, maybe WTO, I don't know. But it's an interesting question, and I think that's something all countries should have a look at. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. On the question of the building agenda in the agriculture as well as in services, indeed. But you've got 7 years to do something, nearly exclusively on agriculture, with many ministerial level meetings and no decision. We haven't got that chance. But in any case, that's the past. Are the acceding countries happy? I don't think China is that unhappy of having acceded WTO. Even if they paid a certain price, I think they've got much more in return. I don't think Vietnam is that unhappy of being in WTO, because if they would not be in WTO, all the investment which is now going from China to Vietnam will probably not happen. So there is not only unhappiness in acceding countries. The sunset clause, Pierre, I think
that was not serious.
I would like to propose that for the post-Bali agenda on services, it can be very quick. It resembles a bit of the sunset clause. But if you have a binding commitment to bind the current practice with a ratchet clause, here you are. It's much better than sunset clause. There is no need for sunset clause. It's going to be automatic liberalization as soon as it goes. Autonomous reform will be automatically bound. That's the best dream for any business. Alessandro's question about sector-specific negotiation, is it going to be easier or not, or bringing more result or not? I have the feeling that actually in the bilateral or in the plurilateral, and also at the time where the gas negotiations were active, these guys were negotiating sector by sector. If you negotiate financial services, you will have the guys from the Treasury and the regulatory authorities coming down and negotiate for their sector. And they're going to do focus on their own sectors. Maybe later on, someone is going to say, no, this is not going to work. But the negotiators are already negotiating sector by sector. If you negotiate something on transport or on telecom, you will have the people coming from the Ministry of Telecom or Ministry of Transport coming in. So these sector-specific are already taking place, I think. So maybe there is no trade-off, that's true. So maybe we could go sector by sector. I don't know about this, but I think that as far as I understand the process, they're already negotiating sector by sector before putting everything into a big pot. Now, on the Chinese, how can we attract developing countries in services negotiations? How can we make sure that the business in the developing countries can be interested into the services negotiation? I think that's a very interesting question. It is already very difficult for my own organization to be sure that the companies are going to be following what's happening in trade policy. Trade policy is not in the radar screen of companies. So if you add then the question of the state-owned enterprises, which are probably going to be dependent on the government, there is, of course, even less interest in looking at what's happening. So the lack of industry support from developing countries in service negotiation, I think, is a very important question. And I can only invite ICT and ITC and other organizations to help us in establishing global coalition of services in different countries, coalition of services industry, so that the industry will understand what's coming on. Because I think there is a huge lack of awareness of what's happening in the different trade negotiations. Now, how bring China into the TISA? I don't think this is more a political question than a tactical question. We have very much expressed clearly support for extension of the TISA participation to any countries. So I think that is bringing back to the question of how to bring TISA back to the WTO. If you have one country which is saying no, it's not going to happen, so basically we know it's not going to happen. It is not going to be from the WTO to say we're going to accept TISA. So the answer of Gabriel is probably the right one. You need Hamid, we need a critical mass. How is this going to happen? To get a critical mass of what? Well, I guess you take what's happening in town, i.e. TISA. But because some countries are against TISA, the critical mass may not ever happen. So we're stuck. We're stuck. And in my own organization, we're really torn into two situations. Is it better to sign TISA soon, quick, so we have finally an agreement on the services on which we can work on? But the basis of that is that the number of participants is not strong enough. From our very beginning, at the beginning of this TISA negotiation, before it was called TISA, our members have clearly said, Pascal, yes, this initiative is good, but we want more countries around the table. We want to have countries where the growth is, or maybe worse, because now it's a bit more complicated already. But this is where we are. So I don't think the answer of that is from the business sector, but we hope that at a point in time a solution is going to be found to have expansion of the TISA to all, so that it will have a critical mass and then we can have an MFN basis. I don't think it will come from the other way around.
I was about to give him a piece of paper saying, please conclude. I've never seen that for a 2-minute intervention. The chair has to give a piece of...
It was 2 minutes and a half.
2 minutes and a half, those are French minutes, no? but a lot to say, of course.
Would you like to give me my paper now?
No, go ahead, Hamid, please.
Thank you. Let me just try to clarify one point which cuts across some of the comments and questions, which I think has been the source of some confusion. The term plurilaterals, I think it means different things for different people, and we need to clarify exactly what that means in WTO speak, in legal terms. We have plurilateral negotiations, and there are plurilateral outcomes, i.e. non-MFN. The plurilateral negotiations that produce MFN applied outcomes are actually almost the only kind of negotiations we've known over the past 70 years. Because by definition, negotiations take place among a subset of the membership. And the outcome involves commitments by that subset applied to everyone. So we always do plurilateral negotiations in the WTO. Even ministers in Hong Kong institutionalized the concept of plurilateral request offer negotiations for the first time. So yes, we do plurilaterals. Everything we do is plurilateral. Trade facilitation is a bit of an odd case. Let's not talk about that now. Please. The plurilateral outcomes, i.e. a government procurement or an FTA, are outcomes that benefit only the signatories. Now TISA, what is TISA going to be? TISA is obviously a plurilateral negotiation. Even if TISA comes down to the lakeside tomorrow, it would still be a plurilateral negotiation because not the 160 would participate. The question is whether TISA eventually would be an Article 5 agreement and would stay outside, or whether, as Pascal was saying, there would be enough other participants that would join TISA with acceptable levels of commitments, and then TISA would be integrated into the GATS and becomes a WTO deal. These are the two viable scenarios that I see are realistic. I don't think there's a third one. There may be theoretical other possibilities, but practically I think these are the only two possibilities. Now, Alejandro's question about sectorals and trade-offs and the differences between services and agriculture in terms of binding existing liberalization in services as opposed to liberalizing existing barriers in agriculture. I think that is one element in the consideration of what would be an acceptable trade-off. First of all, we didn't say ever that the services negotiations should stop at the binding of existing liberalization only. After all, Article 19 speaks of progressively higher levels of liberalization, not progressively higher levels of commitments only, but liberalization. So the treaty presumption is that there has to be increasing liberalization. So it is not exactly that black and white. But it's a question of the political judgment at the end of the negotiations about what would be acceptable. Now, sectoral, do you really want to go sectoral? You negotiate sectorally anyway. You cannot have any meaningful negotiations without involving the sectoral experts, the sector regulators, because the negotiating ministry here is not the regulating ministry. We see that this is one of the institutional challenges of services, and we see it also in accession negotiations. The last point is about plurilaterals, and Hiroki's question about are we going to apply a plurilateral approach to services? I think my answer is that it is already applied. Once we resume the services negotiations, then this is exactly where we're going to go. About the developing country interest, I think there is an important point here to realize. I have witnessed and I've observed a certain disconnect between developing countries' policy direction in capitals and the negotiating, take the pen away from him, please, and the negotiating positions. It's like you see developing countries promoting foreign investment using all means, including bilateral investment treaties, and Rolf is sitting here who would tell you about that more than what you ever want to know.
That's for sure. That's for sure.
But at the same time, when it comes to commitments on Mode 3, you get a completely different perspective. What I'm saying is that there were times in history where we saw that gap closing. And the negotiations on financial services and telecommunications are a very good example. We need to ask the question, why were the 4th and 5th protocol to the GATS subscribed to by a very wide number of developing countries who did not actually link those commitments to anything else that was going on? There was no textiles, there was no agriculture, there was nothing. These were single sector negotiations because there is an increasing realization that more commitments would provide the kind of stability and predictability and guarantees that would attract foreign investments. This is one important realization. The other realization is the role of liberalizing and opening up in developing your own indigenous services sectors, and the increasing realization that there is a close link between efficient services and the effectiveness of the entire economy is on the rise. Let me just make one last commercial about a very, very nice piece of research that we have seen from the Fung Institute and it was sent to me by our friend Patrick Lowe, about the cost of a loaf of bread, something that is very basic and any developing country can relate to, and the services inputs in producing a loaf of bread. And guess what? The percentage of services value added in a loaf of bread was 73%. The bread produced in China and sold in China and in Hong Kong. 73%. What would be the effect of having efficient and competitive and high-quality services on the price of a loaf of bread, which is something that every government would worry about? I think that realization is on the rise, and hopefully we get out of the negotiating game and we start talking sense. Thank you.
Egyptian minutes are even longer. Amazing.
Oh, we're 7,000 years old.
Yeah, I know, but still, Okay, Ricardo and Martin, would you like to join me? I think this brings a close to this last session. If you would please join me in thanking our discussants and our speaker for a very, very insightful set of presentations.
No, you can stay.
You can stay if you want.
That's faster. Whatever is more efficient. Thank you, Pierre. And that was an excellent panel, I think. I have about 10 pages of notes, and I've been in and out of the room for the past day and a half, and so I'm not going to read them. But I can't also just go away without making some comments about what has been said. So let me start by joining or reacting to some of the remarks that Pierre has made before about his age and Hamid and other people in the room and the experience they have on the services negotiations. I myself was baptized on GATT negotiations in services back at the time when my ambassador Felipe Jaramillo, who is probably responsible to a great extent for the kind of agreement that we have in place today, was then the chairman of the negotiating group in services in 1988. So for me, it was difficult to become critical of the GATT itself. I thought when we finished, after the very creative effort that were made during the negotiations to come up with the 4 modes of delivery and so on, I thought that this was a piece of art. So it was only with little time that we understood that there were many issues with it and concerns, and that we needed to some more work. So that's just to say that I'm not as old as Pierre or Hamid, probably not as wise. I'm not looking forward to retiring to write novels, and I think that Pierre should actually retire to make movies, and Hamid to probably to sing, but or write songs. But following that sort of line of analogy, I think what we have seen through the evolution of the GATTs, it's more in line with John Lennon's song to his son Shan when he was born, when he said that life is what happens to you while you're making other plans. And that's sort of what has happened with the GATTs and how we evolved the GATTs, including the built-in sort of provisions for further liberalization and evolution of the GATTs itself. So what we have seen as during the 2 days it's a confirmation that the world has changed in a very dramatic and fundamental way when it comes to generally production and trade, but particularly the role of services in that world. What hasn't catch up, I think, through this day and a half, is not just the WTO, but it's policy and policy making with reference to services, and again the role of services in the economy. So we continue to look at services in many places from a policy-making perspective in ways that are far from ideal, in a very fragmented manner, and in a way again that does not really yet reflect that role of services in the economy. And I suspect that that's the case, not just from, if you like, a commercial perspective or even an economics perspective on services and policy, but also when it comes to the role of services in development. And so when I hear about services and development, and there's been lots that has been written about it, I think that we're still far from understanding and then capturing this in institutional development and in policy development that in a way that would be fair to, again, the evolution that we have of that role of services in economies. But so very quickly about what we have heard in the past day and a half, it just makes me happy to see that with the thinking that we have on ICTSD, with Cherries and Johannes and other colleagues that have worked in services for the past few years with us, we seem to be sort of on target. Some of the things that I said yesterday when we opened have been just reiterated through the day and a half. On what's necessary and what are the paths going forward, I think it can be said that there's some, this is going to sound as a simplification, but there's some clarity on at least what paths we can take going forward. And it seems to me that there are three, or it can be synthesized in three paths. We call these new horizons of services on trade governance. And I think it was Gabriel or it was Johannes in the earlier panel today that said that the objective that we have in front of us with respect to services trade governance is to build a multilateral agreement on services that catches up with all these nuances of the new global economy. If that's the case, I think we just heard we can either do it practically by continuing on the TISA sort of what has been opened by TISA, that kind of path. There was a paper that was a non-paper that was distributed by the EU back in September of 2012 that looked at what they called a model approach to multilateralization of TISA. That was at the time of this exploratory talks on the plurilateral agreement. And I would suggest that people go back to that paper. It's a 3-page paper, which is a very simple proposal of how you move TISA forward so that it really does this trick of building a multilateral agreement on services, that it's stronger and catches up. So TISA as a means to getting a stronger multilateral agreement on services. Now, what that would require is one, you go through 3 phases: the phase of negotiations, through a phase of enlargement, probably together with the negotiations, and then 3, the multilateralization. The key here is the enlargement. There is an incentive for countries that participate in the TISA to bring in other countries, because that would then allow them to do away with the free rider question and then incorporate, as Hamid just before explained, the outcome of their negotiations in the GATS. So with respect to commitments, including standstill and ratcheting and so on, and new commitments, they could be brought in through scheduling, of course, on an MFN basis. But for that, you need to ensure that you have the participation that would provide that, again, the critical mass that would be required to deal with this. All other developments in TISA that have to do with rules and other disciplines and so on, again, there are ways in the architecture of the GATS that would allow them to bring them in through Article 18 or so, through annexes, through understandings or reference papers and so on. So there's a way, that's the point. One way is that you move TISA purposely as a means to strengthen the multilateral architecture that we have on services. Again, the beauty there, if you like, is that there's an incentive for the TISA participants to bring in the governments that would make the critical mass, and there's no threat to those that don't want to participate. They will just, again, all these commitments would be made available to them, and they would enjoy the commitments, if you like, without having to make commitments themselves. A second way forward, which is probably what we are about to see started, is TISA negotiations outside the WTO, and then a GATS, some work on GATS through the Bali Work Program, and moving in sort of parallel, both this TISA and this work on GATS, and towards some likely convergence somewhere in a very uncertain future. Now, for that Bali Work Program will probably, there's something that could be accommodated in terms of institutionalizing regulatory cooperation, for instance, as I was suggesting yesterday and other people did today. And so there's a possibility of doing something in the Bali Work Program that goes in parallel with TISA, and as I said, I mean, they just would create two instruments in that governance of services that will likely converge somewhere in the future. And a third sort of simple or simplified path forward is just the continuous or probably increasing fragmentation of services governance in a multi-speed world that would be characterized simply by a TISA plus then in another dimension, the FTAs, the mega regionals, and so on, plus the GATS that we have today, sort of in the state of the 1994 GATS. That's this possibilities of going forward are up to the negotiators. What we have done here today, the work that we're doing ourselves at ICTSD with the A15 expert group on services, and other work that we do there, the efforts that Pierre and other academics are making to try to bring light in the details of how all this works. That's all for the negotiators and the delegates and policymakers to take and make decisions on how they move forward. And so in that respect, I think, and I close here, that this has been, as you've said, very optimistically, when you look at the room and you look at it as a full room, that has been a successful conference, and it's a good effort, and we probably have to do more of this. So thank you again, Pierre. Thank you everybody for the participation. Thank you to the speakers for having joined us in this effort, and thank you to my colleagues for putting this together. So thanks.
Thank you. I don't think you'll need to pass me a piece of paper to tell me to stop. Yeah, you can do that. No, I think I'll be brief at this point. I mean, the title of the conference was New Horizons in the Services Trade. What we heard on one of the things we heard, for example, on one of the teams, which were legal issues, we heard that there was very limited jurisprudence on cats. So, of course, we could have said the same thing 15 years ago. On economic issues, we heard, well, we have no good data. Again, we could have said the same thing some time back. And more recently, on political economy, policy-oriented sessions, we heard, well, the GATS has delivered little, and I guess we could have said the same thing some time back. But of course, these things don't change, and what I want to do is to thank people who presented during this conference, because actually we saw in the different presentations on these three broad themes that they did touch on the new horizons and new issues and the new frontiers on services trade. And on each of these themes, I think we have managed to touch on what is currently most relevant. And I don't want to do a full listing of this, but I think the presenters are to be commended for that. The other thing I think that made this a good conference and hopefully will lead to a good book is the participation, and I'd like to thank you, the experts, services experts, the delegates and others who came here, because it's very important for people who present and the discussants and share also to get feedback and get discussions, and this makes really for much better contributions and final drafts. So I think presenters are also grateful for your participation in this. And just to before leaving the final word to Pierre, I'd like to thank Pierre also, because he's in a way the origin of all this. Thank ICTSD, Ricardo and Sherry and all their team, which did a very impressive job in organizing this. Delegations and the Ambassador Duque from Colombia and De Mateo from Mexico, who sponsored this, and I'd like to thank them for that, as well as all the help we got in-house. Thank you. I mean, there really is such a thing as first mover advantage. I mean, when you're the last to speak, everything's been said. So I'm going to keep it super short and mostly express thanks in the spirit that Martin did. Martin is a very old friend and a fellow countryman, and we've been wanting to do a book together for a long time. And before I retire, I thought we should do one. And so when Edward Elgar kindly approached me and said, would you want to do a research handbook? And having been on the other side of a research handbook as a contributor, but seeing how much work the editors had to undergo in producing a book of that magnitude, I immediately called Martin, who is younger, full of energy, someone to whom I could outsource much of my pain and still be co-editor. And, you know, I have powers of persuasion, and he said yes, to my great surprise, and I was so happy. So I thank him, because even before we came to Sherry and said, Sherry, what do you think if we were to do a knowledge-sharing event that would join forces between WTI and ICTSD? A lot of work. I can't count the hundreds and hundreds of email messages in contacting authors and agreeing on contributions. And producing a research handbook is not easy, because you're asking scholars to produce serious work. They're all too busy, and you say, it's for the pure joy of science. I have no money to give you. And usually that's the end of the conversation. They say, let's talk some other time. Well, no, we managed to get a remarkable set of scholars, as I said yesterday, old and new, and there's a very nice sense of movement, I think, in this book, and focus on a very rich set of issues. You got a sample of that over the last day and a half. I come out of this meeting with a sense of frustration, because a day and a half is not enough. And I wish we could present all of the papers. Many of them are outstanding, and those voices were not heard. And that's a pity, and so we have to think, maybe, Sherry, the next conference we just bring the other contributors and we share those papers on very exciting issues as well, including Magnus will be happy, Mode 4, managed mobility issues, domestic regulatory issues, subsidiarity perspectives on rulemaking, and so on and so forth. So a very rich set of menu of issues. So I come out of these discussions frustrated at the fact that we were not able to do more, but very much enthused at the interest that I think we were able to generate, the feedback we got from participants, the fact that negotiations are difficult, the fact that negotiations are complex, the fact that there is tremendous pent-up frustration in this institution seemingly does nothing to dent interest in the subject. And I think that's what we have to do, and that's what we have to keep doing, keep feeding the conversation with novel ideas in the hope that at some point traction will be generated. We used the three core languages of trade diplomacy as guides to the design of this book and this conference. We use the language of law, we use the language of economics, and we use the language of political economy. Those are the three languages you need to master to make sense of a complex world of economic and trade governance. And the idea is to say, let's try to come up with some ideas so that we don't need another language, which would be archaeology. We don't want archaeology because that would suggest that the GATS and the WTO are incapable of evolutionary change. So my hope is that when we produce the book, we're able to share these insights with you and avoid the need for yet another research handbook that will have law, economics, political economy, and architecture. We attempted to liberalize trade and services, and we're not able to. That's not what we want. We want to just feed ideas into the policy-making process. I close by thanking Ricardo and ICTSD, Sherry, with whom I have exchanged, I think, also thousands of emails. These are complex endeavors. It looks easy, and ICTSD makes it look easy, and I really applaud the professionalism and the spirit of cooperation that made this possible. We travel all the time. We were exchanging emails over different time zones, and yet it comes together in a very, very nice way, in a way that I think made people feel comfortable in this room. So Sherry, there will come a time in the near future where you will love me again, and I love you, and I say this in public. We're being webcasted. What if my wife looks at this? Let me take that back. I really, really like her as a colleague and friend. I love you, my dear. Isabelle in Versailles. We're being webcast. Can you take that off the tape, please? This is not going to work. So please, let me end at that. Thank you all, and we look forward to you buying copious quantities of a research handbook that we hope will be out on the market in the first half of 2015. Thank you so much.